Dry Hollow wasn't much of a town, just a dozen sun-faded buildings stretched along a dusty trail between the mesas. Folks didn't talk much, and when they did, it was usually about the weather, the price of flour, or how long before the next dust storm rolled in. But if you asked anyone about the smithy at the far end of town, their voice would drop, and their eyes would flick toward the ground. No one really knew where the blacksmith came from. He just showed up one day years back, scarred and silent, with a horse loaded down with iron tools and 2 massive hammers slung across his back. He built his forge with his own hands, never asked for help, and never once spoke a word, not even when spoken to. They called him Smith, because that was all he did. He fixed wagon wheels, shoed horses, reforged broken blades, and did it with the kind of focus that made even the most talkative men go quiet around him. He lived alone, worked by day, and drank rainwater by night. Kids would sneak by and try to catch a glimpse of him through the smoke and sparks, but all they'd ever see was the steady rhythm of hammer to steel and the glow of firelight reflecting in his eyes. Then one day, the outlaws came. They weren't like the usual drifters. These men rode under a black banner and called themselves the Thorned Sons. Their leader, a cold-eyed gunslinger named Rigcalder, was known for leaving ghost towns in his wake. They came to Dry Hollow like wolves through tall grass, slow and watching. Knowing no one would stand against them, Sheriff Morton tried. He met them in the street, with his badge pinned straight and his shotgun loaded. They shot him where he stood. After that, the townsfolk kept their heads down. Stores were looted, food was taken, and women were harassed. The Thorned Sons set up camp like they owned the place. Smith didn't leave his forge. A week passed, and the townsfolk began to notice something strange. The forge, which usually rested silent by sundown, was burning all night. They saw shadows moving inside, heavy, deliberate, constant. Smith wasn't just fixing horseshoes anymore. Inside, the silent man was working with an intensity that defied the summer heat. He reforged steel with a craftsman's touch and a soldier's purpose. Pieces of old iron were reshaped, melded, repurposed. Blades sharpened, chains twisted, hooks, hinges, bolts, all forged not for trade but for war. When Widow Hensley's boy, Luke, brought water to him one evening, he found the smith seated beside a long bench, cleaning a heavy revolver with hands both careful and practiced. Without speaking, Smith handed the boy a wrapped bundle of nails and pointed to the boarded-up church. Luke didn't ask why. He just nodded and ran off. The next morning, strange things began to happen. A horse the outlaws had stolen was found, loose, its reins tied in a complicated knot no one could undo. A barrel of gunpowder went missing. A rusted bell from the chapel reappeared, hanging from a noose over the outlaws' campfire. They laughed it off at first until Calder's lieutenant found his boots nailed to the saloon floor and a sharpened horseshoe around his neck. That night, Rig called for a meeting in the center of town. Lanterns were lit, and the townsfolk dragged from their homes. The Thorned Sons wanted to send a message. Smith stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, his face unreadable in the glow. Rig stepped forward, wearing a smile like a knife. "I don't know which one of you got brave," he said, voice smooth and oily, "but you're gonna stop, or I start breaking people." No one spoke. Then a loud clang echoed from the forge. Smith had turned and walked away. Rig's smile twitched. That him? He asked no one in particular. That the mute? No answer. All right, then, Rig said. Tomorrow night, we burn the forge. And just like that, the line was drawn. The morning after Rig Calder's threat was quieter than most, though not for lack of fear. The people of Dry Hollow went about their tasks with the brittle silence of those living under a storm cloud. They watched the Thorned Sons swagger through the streets, laughing, drinking, acting like they owned the dust and sky alike. The forge, however, did not sleep. Smith's fire still burned. Inside, the smith's hands moved like they were following music only he could hear, measured, graceful, precise. Steel hissed in the water trough. Sparks flew and danced like fireflies. Behind the anvil, a shape was beginning to take form, long, black, and deadly. A warhammer forged not for ceremony but for finality. No one had seen Smith fight before. They didn't know if he could. He'd been silent for years, never even raised his voice, let alone a weapon. But now, each clang of iron on iron sounded like a countdown. Luke Hensley returned that afternoon. His mother had tried to keep him home, but curiosity or maybe loyalty dragged him back to the forge. Smith glanced up as the boy entered and gave him a slow nod. Then he handed Luke a small bag filled with nails, wedges, and iron spikes. The boy opened it and frowned. "What's all this for?" Smith took a long piece of chalk and knelt near the dirt floor. In swift, clean lines, he drew a square with 4 X marks each placed on what appeared to be the corners of Dry Hollow. Then he tapped each with a knuckle. "Traps," Luke whispered. Smith gave a slight nod. Luke stared for a moment, then glanced around the forge at the other strange tools, the lengths of chain, the sharpened picks, the black netting coiled in a corner. You're going to fight them, aren't you?" The smith didn't answer. He simply stood, lifted the half-finished warhammer, and returned to work. That evening, as the sun began to set behind the jagged hills, the townsfolk gathered in hushed groups, whispering guesses and fears. The Thorned Sons were already drunk, hooting and hollering near the saloon. Rig Calder wasn't among them. He was at the sheriff's old office, oiling his long-barreled pistol and watching the forge with a hunter's eye. At the stroke of midnight, 3 of the outlaws, laughing and careless, approached the forge. Torches in hand, Smith was inside. They didn't bother knocking. One kicked the door open while the others moved to set fire to the walls. But the first man barely took 2 steps before the floor beneath him gave way. He dropped with a shout into a pit lined with steel spikes, none fatal, but more than enough to leave him howling in pain. The other 2 froze. And in that moment, the forge doors slammed shut behind them. The townsfolk didn't see what happened next, but they heard it, metal striking bone, grunts, a crash, then silence. In the morning, the 3 men were gone. The forge door was closed, as always, but outside, nailed to the post, hung a message burned into wood, with the heat of the forge itself. "Leave or be broken." Rig Calder stared at the sign for a long while. Then he turned to his men and said, "We kill him tonight." As dusk fell, Smith wasn't in the forge. Instead, he walked through town for the first time in weeks. He checked alleyways, rooftops, the steeple of the old chapel. He moved like a man who already knew what was coming. He stopped at the graves behind the church. No one knew whose names were etched on those stones, only that Smith visited them sometimes, always in silence, with a look of old regret in his eyes. He knelt there now, his hammer on his back and the wind tugging at his coat. A single red bandana fluttered from one of the headstones. Then he stood, and, somewhere far off, the cry of a hawk echoed, a signal, perhaps, or a warning. The Thorned Sons were coming, and Dry Hollow would never be the same. Asterisk. Night came early to Dry Hollow that day, as if the sun itself wanted nothing to do with what was coming. Shadows stretched longer than usual, and the wind carried a nervous hum through the brittle grass and rusted fences. The townsfolk shuttered their windows and locked their doors, each holding their breath behind creaking wood and dusty curtains. Smith stood alone in the square, just outside his forge. He wore a leather apron over his broad chest, now reinforced with strips of iron. A chain looped across his shoulder like a sash. His hammer hung from his belt. Around him, the traps he had laid were invisible to the untrained eye. Trip lines, greased nails, pressure plates beneath loose dirt, all built by a man who'd studied destruction the way others studied books. Atop the chapel, young Luke lay belly down with a spyglass and a lantern covered in red cloth. His job was to signal when the Thorned Sons began their approach. He hadn't told his mother. She wouldn't have allowed it. But something inside him had changed when he'd seen the way Smith moved, so sure, so prepared. Luke wanted to be part of that. The Thorned Sons came just after midnight. There were 12 of them, this time Rig Calder at the front, riding a pale horse with red eyes and a black mane. His coat was dusted in silver thread, and his revolver rested low on his hip, too casual to be anything but deadly. They didn't sneak. They didn't have to. They came in laughing, confident, drunk on power and blood. Luke lit the lantern. Smith raised his head, watching from beneath the brim of his hat. The first man crossed the tripwire and triggered a whistling snap. A counterweight dropped from the chapel tower, sending a bundle of iron rods swinging across the alley. The man never had time to scream, just a flash of pain before he dropped. That stopped the others. Rig scowled. He's turned the town into a damn maze. From behind the forge, a metal spike flew through the air and buried itself into a post beside another outlaw's head. A warning, not a miss. Split up, Rig barked. Flush him out. The gang scattered, moving between buildings in groups of 2 and 3. But Dry Hollow wasn't the town it had been yesterday. Every alley had been rewired. Every door that looked open led to snares. Nails lay just beneath the surface of dirt. Paths. One man opened the stable door, only for a counterweight to drop a load of bricks from the hayloft onto his back. Screams echoed through the dark. Smith waited. He wasn't in the forge. He wasn't behind a wall. He was right where they least expected him to be, standing still in the town square. And when the two biggest of the outlaws rounded the general store and saw him, they paused for a moment too long. Smith moved like thunder. The warhammer came down with a crash, knocking one man into the dirt with a sound that sent birds flying from the trees. The second man raised his gun, but Smith's other hand threw a hooked chain that wrapped around the outlaw's arm and yanked him off balance. A second blow silenced him. The townsfolk watched through the cracks in their windows. For years they had wondered who the silent Smith truly was. Now they knew. He was a man forged in fire and loss, and tonight he was no longer hiding. Rig Calder kicked down the saloon door, furious, his men dropping like flies. "Smith," he shouted into the night. "You want a war? You've got one." Smith didn't answer. He only walked toward the sound of the voice, warhammer dragging behind him, leaving a trail of sparks along the ground. The two finally saw each other face to face. "You think you can scare me, blacksmith?" Rig hissed. "I've burned towns like this before breakfast." Smith said nothing. He only raised his hammer and stepped forward. Rig drew his pistol. The shot rang out. Smith staggered, but didn't fall. He took another step. A second shot, this one grazed his shoulder. But, again, he kept coming. Rig's eyes widened. The hammer rose, and the battle for Dry Hollow truly began. Night fell over Dry Hollow, draping the town in shadows and quiet tension. The once dusty streets now held an eerie stillness, broken only by the distant howls of coyotes and the soft crackle of the dying fire in Smith's forge. But beneath this calm, a storm was gathering, a storm born from years of silence and the sudden threat posed by the thorned suns. Smith stood outside his forge, his silhouette framed by the fading glow of embers. His face was calm but determined, the long hours of preparation evident in the steady grip on his warhammer. Around him lay the traps he had set, hidden spikes, tripwires, and carefully balanced weights, all designed to protect the town he had come to call home. The outlaws approached, their confident swagger replaced by cautious steps. They knew Dry Hollow was no longer a helpless target. Rig Calder led the group, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings as he tried to anticipate the Smiths' defenses. Without a word, the battle began. The first outlaw to cross a hidden wire stumbled into a pit lined with sharpened stakes. A chain net fell from above, entangling another before he could even raise his weapon. The sounds of surprise and frustration echoed through the night. But Smith moved like a force of nature, striking with the weight of years spent mastering his craft. His warhammer swung with precision and power, knocking back one attacker after another. Though a deep cut marked his side and sweat soaked his brow, Smith's resolve never wavered. Each movement was purposeful, every strike aimed at protecting those who could not fight. From their hiding places, the townspeople found their courage. Old Thomlin, with a rifle he hadn't fired in years, took aim and fired a steady shot. The preacher's daughter rolled barrels to block paths, and others poured boiling water and sand to slow the attackers' horses. Rig, seeing his men falter, charged toward Smith, gun drawn and eyes blazing. The two met in the center of the street, a clash not just of fists but of wills. They grappled, each testing the other's strength. Smith's hammer struck the ground as he dodged a quick strike from Rig's knife, the dust rising in thick clouds around them. Finally, with one decisive movement, Smith forced Rig to his knees. Breathing hard, Smith looked down and said, "Leave Dry Hollow. Never return." Rig's defiant glare softened into grudging respect. The remaining outlaws scattered into the night, their threat broken. The townsfolk slowly emerged from their homes, faces alight with gratitude and hope. Smith nodded quietly and returned to his forge, where the warm glow awaited him once more. Dry Hollow had survived the night. The dawn painted Dry Hollow in soft shades of gold and pink, washing away the shadows of the night's battle. The streets were quiet again, but the air carried a new energy of fragile hope, woven with the scars of what had just passed. Smith sat on the porch of his forge, his warhammer resting beside him, still heavy but no longer a weapon of war. His shirt was torn, the cut on his side cleaned and bandaged, but his eyes held the calm resolve of a man who had faced down the darkness and refused to bow. The townsfolk moved cautiously through the streets, assessing the damage. Broken barrels and scattered debris marked the places where traps had been sprung and battles had raged. Yet, despite the destruction, there was no desperate determination to rebuild and protect the home they had reclaimed. Old Thomlin, leaning on his worn rifle, approached the smith with a nod. "You did good, son," he said, his voice rough but warm. "Never thought I'd see the day Dry Hollow stood its ground." Smith gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. No words were needed. At the edge of town, Luke Hensley watched the sun rise, his eyes bright with a new understanding. The silent smith had shown him what it meant to be brave, not just with a weapon, but with heart. In the days that followed, the town worked together. Boards were hammered back into place, fences repaired, and fields tended. The forge, once a place of solitude, became a gathering spot where stories were shared and plans made. Smith worked alongside the others, his hands steady and sure as he repaired tools and fashioned new ones. He still spoke little, but his presence spoke volumes. One evening, as the sun dipped low, the preacher's daughter approached the smith with a simple loaf of bread. She smiled softly and said, "Thank you for everything." Smith accepted the gift with a nod, his eyes meeting hers for the briefest moment. It was the closest thing to a conversation he had given in years. Dry Hollow was not just a place on a map anymore. It was a symbol of courage, resilience, and the quiet strength of one man who refused to give in. And as the stars emerged overhead, the forge's fire burned steadily once more, a beacon against the night. Weeks had passed since the thorned sons fled Dry Hollow, but the silence that settled over the town was not the silence of fear. It was the quiet of healing. The smith's forge glowed warmly each evening, a steady heartbeat in a town learning to breathe freely again. Smith himself had returned to his old rhythms, hammer, striking anvil, sparks flying like stars against the dark, but now, the work carried new meaning. Each tool, each horseshoe, each repaired plow was a promise of a future they would build together. Luke Hensley, no longer just a boy, watching from afar, had become an apprentice. He learned not only how to shape metal but the strength and patience that came with it. Smith was a silent teacher, but his actions spoke louder than words. One afternoon, as they worked side by side, Luke broke the quiet. "Will they come back?" he asked, eyes fixed on a glowing horseshoe. Smith paused, considering. "Maybe. But Dry Hollow won't be the same. We're ready now." Luke nodded, the weight of those words sinking in. Outside town, the hills seemed quieter too, as if the land itself exhaled after a long-held breath. The outlaw's threat had been broken, but the memory remained like a scar that reminded the people to stay vigilant. One evening, the town gathered around the old chapel. The preacher spoke softly about courage, not just the courage to fight, but the courage to rebuild and forgive. The community's bonds, once fragile, had grown strong. Smith stood apart, watching the flickering candlelight on familiar faces. For the first time, he allowed himself a small smile. The town had given him purpose, and in return, he had given them hope. As the stars blanketed the sky, the smith returned to his forge. His hammer struck the anvil, steady and sure, each ring echoing through Dry Hollow, a sound not of war, but of life. Months had passed since the night the thorned sons fled, and Dry Hollow had transformed. The once weary town now stood with quiet dignity, its wounds healing under the steady hands of its people. The forge fire glowed every evening like a beacon, a symbol of resilience and renewal. Smith had become more than the silent craftsman. He was a guardian, a steady presence in the lives of those who had come to trust him. Luke, now skilled and confident, worked beside him, carrying forward the lessons of strength and patience. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, a rider approached the town. Dust trailing behind, the figure carried no weapons, only a worn leather satchel. The townsfolk watched cautiously as the rider dismounted and made his way toward the forge. Smith met the rider at the door. The man removed his hat, revealing a face weathered by travel but kind in its gaze. "I heard about Dry Hollow's stand," he said simply. "I come with word. The outlaw threat has lessened. Others have taken your stand as a warning." Smith nodded slowly, relief and pride mingling in his expression. The rider smiled. "You've changed the story of this place." As night settled, the townsfolk gathered around the forge, sharing stories, laughter, and the quiet peace earned through courage. The smith looked on, his hammer resting beside the glowing coals. No longer a weapon but a tool of creation. Dry Hollow had survived the storm, and in the silence that followed, hope burned brighter than any fire.